The pre-dawn air at Fort Braxton carried the scent of Carolina pines and the promise of another sweltering summer day. Private Aaliyah Williams laced your combat boots with the practiced precision of someone who had grown up around military precision, each movement deliberate and efficient. At 19, she possessed a quiet confidence that some mistook for arrogance, but those who looked closer would recognize it as the bearing of someone raised to understand duty, honor, and the weight of legacy. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. Williams, your bunk looks like a hurricane hit it. Start over. Sergeant Derek Morrison's voice cut through the pre-dawn quiet of the barracks like a rusty blade. Aaliyah glanced at her perfectly made bunk, corners sharp enough to cut paper, every wrinkle smoothed with military precision. Around her, other recruits exchanged glances, recognizing the familiar pattern that had emerged over the past weeks. "Yes, Sergeant," Aaliyah responded crisply, stripping her bed without hesitation. This was her final week of basic training, and she had learned that arguing with Morrison only made things worse. As she remade her bed for the third time that morning, she caught the eye of her bunkmate, Private Maria Rodriguez, who offered a subtle look of solidarity. Maria had been documenting Morrison's behavior in a small notebook she kept hidden in her footlocker. As the daughter of Salvadoran immigrants, she recognized the coded language, the disproportionate attention, the way Morrison's criticism of Aaliyah always carried an edge that his corrections of white recruits lacked. Her father had served 20 years in the Army, rising to Sergeant First Class despite facing similar challenges, and had taught her to recognize injustice even when it wore the uniform of authority. 300 yards away, Colonel Marcus Williams stood on the observation deck of the training headquarters, his weathered hands wrapped around a cup of coffee that had long gone cold. At 45, he carried himself with the bearing of a man who had earned every insignia on his uniform through dedication, sacrifice, and an unwavering commitment to the values the Army claimed to represent. What his subordinates didn't know was that among the recruits currently enduring their final week of basic training was his daughter, enlisted under her mother's maiden name to avoid any appearance of favoritism. The decision to remain anonymous during her training had been Aaliyah's, made during a heated discussion the night before she shipped out to Fort Braxton. "I need to know I can do this on my own merit, Dad," she had said, her jaw set with the same determination that had carried him through 2 decades of military service. "If they know who I am, every achievement gets an asterisk." Now, watching the morning PT formation through his binoculars, Marcus spotted his daughter among the sea of olive-drab uniforms. Even from a distance, he could see the straight line of her shoulders, the measured cadence of her step, the leadership qualities that emerged naturally despite her conscious efforts to blend in. She was helping Private Johnson, a mountain of a young man from rural Mississippi who struggled with the technical aspects of equipment maintenance, adjust his gear properly. Tank Johnson had joined the Army to escape the crushing poverty of his hometown, but the transition from rural Mississippi to military structure had been jarring. At 6'4" and 250 pounds of muscle, he looked intimidating, until you noticed his gentle eyes and hesitant manner. Aaliyah had been quietly helping him with equipment maintenance for weeks, showing him techniques for organizing his gear and breaking down complex procedures into manageable steps. "Thanks, Williams," Tank whispered as she helped him adjust his wed belt. Morrison's attention snapped to the interaction like a predator sensing movement. "Johnson, if you can't manage basic equipment maintenance without help from other recruits, maybe you don't belong here." The barb was clearly aimed at both of them, questioning not only Tank's competence, but implying that Aaliyah's assistance somehow undermined military discipline. She felt the familiar tightness in her shoulders, but kept her expression neutral, a skill learned from years of watching her father navigate similar challenges. "Sergeant, I was just—" Tank began. "I didn't ask for explanations, Private. Drop and give me 50. As Tank complied without protest, his massive frame hitting the ground with resigned obedience, Aaliyah fought the urge to speak up. Every instinct, every value her father had instilled in her screamed against allowing a fellow soldier to be punished for her actions. But she also understood the delicate balance of military hierarchy and the consequences of challenging a drill instructor's authority. From his observation post, Colonel Williams watched the interaction with growing unease. Through his binoculars, he could see the tension in the formation, the way other recruits averted their eyes, the subtle but unmistakable dynamic of a leader abusing his authority. He made a note in his leather-bound journal, adding to a growing collection of concerns about certain aspects of the training program. Staff Sergeant Jennifer Thompson approached the formation, her presence immediately noticeable by the way Morrison straightened his posture. Thompson had been watching Morrison's methods with increasing concern, recognizing patterns that violated both the spirit and letter of military training doctrine. As one of the few women in senior training positions, she had faced her own challenges climbing the ranks, developing a keen eye for the subtle ways bias manifested in military environments.
"Sergeant Morrison," she said, her voice carrying the authority of rank and experience, "I need to speak with you about this afternoon's field exercise schedule." Morrison's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. Thompson's interventions had become more frequent over the past weeks, and he interpreted her oversight not as appropriate leadership, but as undermining his authority with the recruits. As the formation dispersed for morning chow, Timothy Walsh caught up with Aaliyah near the mess hall entrance. The 19-year-old from small-town Ohio had grown up in a community where diversity meant Catholics and Protestants worshiping in different churches. His military service had been an education in perspectives he'd never encountered, and lately he'd begun noticing disparities in how different recruits were treated. "Williams," he said quietly, glancing around to ensure Morrison wasn't within earshot. "That thing with Johnson wasn't fair. You were just helping a battle buddy." Aaliyah studied his earnest face, seeing genuine confusion and the beginning of awareness. "It's not about fair, Walsh. It's about finishing what we started." But privately, she wondered how much longer she could maintain her composure. The constant scrutiny, the disproportionate criticism, the subtle but persistent message that she didn't belong, it was wearing on her in ways she hadn't anticipated. Each night, she stared at the ceiling of her bunk, drawing strength from memories of her father's stories about his own early military experiences, about the importance of proving yourself through excellence and perseverance rather than complaint. What she didn't know was that her father was facing his own moral dilemma, watching from a distance as the daughter he had raised to embody military values encountered the same systemic challenges that had shaped his own career. The next few days would test both of them in ways that would ultimately transform not just their relationship, but the institution they both served. The mess hall buzzed with the controlled chaos of hungry recruits fueling up for another day of intensive training. Aaliyah sat with her usual group, Maria, Tank, and Timothy, picking at her regulation breakfast while mentally preparing for the challenges ahead. Around them, conversations centered on the upcoming graduation ceremony, speculation about duty assignments, and the nervous excitement of soldiers about to complete their transformation from civilians to warriors. Morrison appeared at their table with the sudden presence of a predator, his shadow falling across Aaliyah's tray. "Williams, when you're done socializing, report to the supply room. Someone needs to inventory and organize the entire cleaning supply closet." The assignment was clearly punitive, a task typically reserved for recruits who had committed disciplinary infractions. Around the mess hall, other recruits received standard duty assignments, equipment maintenance, administrative tasks, or preparation for upcoming training exercises. Only Aaliyah received orders that would consume her precious few hours of personal time. "Roger, Sergeant," she replied without inflection, meeting his gaze with steady composure that seemed to further irritate him. After Morrison moved on to terrorize other tables, Maria leaned in close. "This is the third time this week he's given you extra duty for no reason. Yesterday, it was scrubbing the latrine floors that were already clean. The day before, it was reorganizing the supply room that had been organized the day before." Timothy pushed his eggs around his plate, his discomfort obvious. "I don't understand why he's always on your case, Williams. You're one of the best soldiers in our company. Your PT scores are higher than most of the guys. You help everyone with their gear, and you never complain about anything." The innocent observation hung in the air, highlighting the disconnect between merit and treatment that had become impossible to ignore. Tank, who had been listening quietly, finally spoke in his soft Mississippi drawl. "It ain't about what she does or doesn't do. It's about who she is." The words carried weight beyond their simplicity. Tank had grown up in a part of Mississippi where certain truths were understood without being spoken, where the color of your skin determined which water fountain you used, which church you attended, which part of town you lived in. His father had worked the same job for 30 years without a promotion, while watching less qualified white men advance, teaching Tank to recognize injustice even when it wore respectable clothes. Maria nodded grimly. "My dad warned me about this. He said there would always be people in the military who see you as different first, soldiers second. He told me to document everything." Meanwhile, in the company commander's office, Staff Sergeant Thompson was having an increasingly uncomfortable conversation with Captain David Chen. The captain sat behind his desk, reviewing personnel files with the detached efficiency of someone more concerned with statistics than individual welfare. "Staff Sergeant, I appreciate your enthusiasm for soldier welfare," Chen said without looking up from his paperwork. "But Sergeant Morrison has 12 years of experience training recruits. His methods might be unorthodox, but he gets results." Thompson straightened her posture, choosing her words carefully. "Sir, with respect, I've observed consistent patterns in Sergeant Morrison's treatment of certain recruits that raise concerns about compliance with equal opportunity policies."
Chen finally looked up, his expression suggesting he found the conversation both tedious and potentially problematic for his career advancement. "Are you alleging discrimination, Staff Sergeant? Because that's a very serious accusation that would require substantial evidence and could reflect poorly on this entire command." The implicit threat wasn't lost on Thompson. In military culture, loyalty to chain of command often superseded individual conscience, and officers who raised uncomfortable questions about their subordinates' methods rarely advanced their careers. Chen was 3 years from his next promotion board, and a discrimination complaint under his command would be a black mark on his record. "I'm suggesting we might want to review training methods to ensure consistency across all recruits, sir," Thompson replied diplomatically, recognizing she was walking a tightrope between duty and career suicide. Chen returned to his paperwork. "Noted, Staff Sergeant. Unless you have specific violations of regulations to report, I suggest you focus on your own responsibilities." Thompson left the meeting with a sick feeling in her stomach, understanding that institutional indifference was often more powerful than individual malice in perpetuating injustice. She had spent 15 years building her career, breaking barriers as one of few women in senior training positions, but she was realizing that her success within the system might have blinded her to its fundamental flaws. That afternoon, during combat training exercises, Morrison's bias became even more explicit. While other recruits received constructive feedback on their techniques, Aaliyah faced public humiliation disguised as instruction. "Williams," Morrison barked as she completed a flawless demonstration of close-quarters combat techniques, "your form is sloppy, your footwork is undisciplined. Maybe if you spent more time practicing and less time playing social worker with the other recruits, you might develop some actual combat skills." The criticism was factually incorrect and professionally inappropriate. Aaliyah's combat scores consistently ranked in the top 5% of their class, and her tactical knowledge exceeded many of her peers. Several recruits who had received praise for similar or inferior performances shifted uncomfortably, recognizing the disparity. Timothy Walsh felt his stomach churning with recognition of an uncomfortable truth he had been avoiding. Over the past weeks, he had received praise for adequate performances, encouragement when he struggled, and second chances when he made mistakes. Morrison's feedback to him was constructive, patient, even friendly. The same instructor who berated Aaliyah for excellence treated him with courtesy despite mediocre results. From his office window 300 yards away, Colonel Williams observed the training exercise through his binoculars, noting the dynamics with growing alarm. His trained eye could assess combat techniques from distance, and what he saw contradicted Morrison's verbal assessment. His daughter's performance was technically superior to most recruits, yet she was receiving criticism that seemed designed to undermine rather than improve. He lowered the binoculars, his jaw clenched with familiar anger. 30 years ago, he had faced similar treatment from a drill instructor who had questioned his commitment to military values and suggested he might be better suited for civilian life. The memory of that humiliation still burned, but it had also forged his determination to succeed and eventually reform the system from within. Now, watching his daughter navigate the same treacherous waters he had once faced, Marcus Williams found himself torn between paternal protective instincts and respect for her determination to prove herself independently. Every fiber of his being wanted to march down to that training field and end Morrison's abuse immediately. But he also recognized that premature intervention might undermine the very independence Aaliyah was fighting to establish. As the day concluded with evening formation, the patterns had become impossible to ignore. While other recruits prepared for well-deserved rest, Aaliyah reported to the supply closet for her punitive assignment. The institutional machinery continued its grinding indifference, but the witnesses were beginning to see clearly, and the foundation was being laid for a confrontation that would ultimately expose the systemic rot beneath the surface of military discipline. The Georgia sun blazed mercilessly at 0800 hours as Charlie Company assembled for their final major field exercise before graduation. The temperature already hovered near 90 degrees, with humidity that made every breath feel like swimming through soup. Recruits checked and rechecked their gear, knowing that today's performance would significantly impact their final evaluations and future military occupational specialty assignments. Aaliyah inspected her equipment with methodical precision, ensuring every piece of gear was properly secured and functional. Her rucksack contained the standard load, plus additional medical supplies she had volunteered to carry, demonstrating the kind of leadership initiative that would normally earn recognition from training cadre. Instead, she noticed Morrison watching her with the predatory attention of someone planning to exploit any opportunity for criticism. "Listen up, maggots," Morrison's voice carried across the formation with its familiar edge of barely contained aggression. "Today's exercise simulates a tactical advance under fire with casualty evacuation. You'll be moving through 12 miles of terrain while carrying full combat loads. Some of you will be selected to carry additional equipment to simulate wounded personnel." Maria Rodriguez stood next to Aaliyah, her own gear meticulously prepared. Over the past weeks, she had filled her hidden notebook with detailed observations of Morrison's differential treatment patterns. Her father's military experience had taught her that documentation was crucial when challenging systemic bias, but she also understood the risks involved in speaking out against a drill instructor. Tank Johnson towered over the formation, his massive frame already showing signs of heat stress. Despite his size and strength, he struggled with endurance exercises, particularly in extreme heat. His rural Mississippi upbringing had accustomed him to physical labor, but not the specific conditioning required for military tactical movements. Timothy Walsh adjusted his web belt nervously, increasingly uncomfortable with his growing awareness of the preferential treatment he received. Morrison's interactions with him were consistently professional, even encouraging, while his treatment of Aaliyah and other minority recruits carried undertones of hostility that were becoming impossible to ignore. "Williams!" Morrison's voice cracked like a whip across the formation. Since you seem to think you're some kind of hotshot leader, you'll be carrying the simulated casualty for the entire exercise." The simulated casualty was a 180-pound dummy designed to replicate the weight and awkwardness of carrying a wounded soldier. Standard procedure called for rotating this burden among multiple soldiers to prevent exhaustion and injury. Assigning it to a single person for 12 miles in extreme heat crossed the line from challenging training into dangerous punishment. Staff Sergeant Thompson, who had been reviewing the exercise plan, looked up sharply. "Sergeant Morrison, the casualty simulation is supposed to rotate every 2 miles among team members. That's outlined in the training manual." Morrison's face flushed red, whether from heat or anger, unclear. "Staff Sergeant, with respect, I'm running this exercise. If Williams can't handle the load, maybe she needs to reconsider whether she's cut out for military service." The challenge to Thompson's authority was clear and inappropriate, but confronting Morrison directly in front of the recruits would undermine military hierarchy. She made a note in her evaluation folder, adding to growing documentation of concerning behavior patterns. As the formation moved out, Aaliyah hefted the dummy across her shoulders in a fireman's carry, settling into the steady pace that her father had taught her during childhood hikes in the North Carolina mountains. The weight was manageable initially, but she understood the cumulative effect it would have over 12 miles in rising heat. By mile 3, sweat poured down her face in steady streams. The dummy's weight seemed to increase with each step, and the heat radiating from the simulated body made breathing more difficult. Around her, other recruits carried standard loads and received regular water breaks, while Morrison specifically denied her requests for hydration. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you're enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now, back to the story. "Thirsty, Williams?" Morrison taunted as they reached the halfway point. "Maybe if you spent less time whining and more time building character, you could handle a little discomfort." Maria watched with growing alarm as Aaliyah began showing signs of heat exhaustion. Her normally steady gait had become slightly unsteady, and her breathing was becoming labored. During her father's military career, she had heard stories about training accidents caused by excessive heat and insufficient hydration. Tank Johnson, despite his own struggles with the heat, began subtly adjusting his position to provide shade for Aaliyah when possible. His size allowed him to block some of the sun's intensity, and his natural instinct to protect others overcame his fear of drawing Morrison's attention. By mile 8, Aaliyah's vision was beginning to blur slightly at the edges. The combination of extreme heat, dehydration, and the constant 180-pound load was pushing her beyond safe physical limits. Her father's voice echoed in her memory, "Never let them see you break." But she was beginning to understand the difference between strength and reckless endangerment. Timothy Walsh could no longer remain silent as he watched a fellow soldier suffering under obviously punitive conditions. His small-town upbringing had instilled values about fairness and helping others, values that were finally overcoming his fear of confronting authority. "Sergeant Morrison," he called out, his voice carrying farther than he intended. "Williams has been carrying that load for 8 miles without a break. Shouldn't someone else take a turn?" The formation slowed as Morrison whirled around, his face contorting with rage at being questioned by a subordinate. The mask of professional military bearing finally slipped completely, revealing the ugliness beneath. "Walsh, you little shit! Nobody asked for your opinion. And Williams, if you need some white boy to defend you, maybe you don't belong in my army." The racial undertones that had been simmering beneath the surface for weeks finally erupted into explicit language. Several recruits stopped walking entirely, stunned by the blatant violation of military professionalism and anti-discrimination policies. "Maybe you people would stop looking for handouts and special treatment. You might actually earn some respect around here." The words hung in the superheated air like poison gas. "You people."
the phrase that removed all pretense and revealed the hatred that had been driving Morrison's behavior from the beginning. Tank Johnson's massive hands clenched into fists, his gentle nature warring with protective instincts. Maria Rodriguez fumbled for her notebook, determined to document every word for future testimony. Aaliyah, despite her physical distress, straightened her shoulders with the dignity that her father had taught her to maintain under all circumstances. "Sergeant, I request that your orders be documented in writing, per Regulation 600-20 regarding training safety protocols." The request was perfectly legitimate, and it was also Morrison's undoing. By demanding written documentation of orders that violated safety regulations, she was creating an official record that could not be ignored or minimized by superior officers. Morrison's response revealed the depth of his loss of control. "You uppity bitch!" he screamed, dropping all pretense of military bearing. "I'll show you what happens when you try to get smart with me." Morrison lunged forward, shoving Aaliyah hard enough to send her stumbling under the weight of the dummy. She managed to maintain her footing, but the assault in front of multiple witnesses had crossed every line of military law and human decency. Staff Sergeant Thompson, who had been monitoring the exercise from a parallel route, arrived just as Morrison raised his hand again. Her appearance froze the scene in a tableau of institutional failure and individual courage. With Aaliyah standing bleeding but unbowed, Morrison caught in mid-assault, and witnesses who could no longer pretend they hadn't seen institutional racism in action. The breaking point had been reached. The system's tolerance for discrimination had finally encountered behavior so egregious that even institutional indifference could not ignore it. The next phase would force everyone involved to choose sides in a confrontation that would ultimately expose the rot beneath Fort Braxton's professional facade. The fluorescent lights in the company headquarters buzzed with mechanical persistence as Staff Sergeant Thompson sat at her desk staring at the formal complaint form that either validated her conscience or destroyed her career. The events of the field exercise played repeatedly in her mind. Morrison's explicit racial language, his physical assault on Aaliyah, the shocked faces of witnesses who could no longer pretend they hadn't seen institutional racism in action. Her fingers hovered over the keyboard as she documented the incident with military precision. Each word was carefully chosen, each phrase crafted to meet the exacting standards of military legal proceedings. She understood that filing this complaint would trigger an investigation that could implicate not just Morrison, but potentially Captain Chen and others in the command structure who had ignored previous warning signs. Incident occurred during tactical field exercise at approximately 10:30 a.m. Staff Sergeant Morrison subjected Private Williams to excessive physical demands beyond safety parameters, denied appropriate hydration breaks, and, when questioned by another recruit about training procedures, responded with racially charged language and physical assault. 20 feet away, Captain Chen was reviewing the morning's training reports, deliberately avoiding eye contact with Thompson. He had received preliminary word about an incident during the field exercise, but had chosen not to investigate immediately, hoping it would resolve itself without requiring official action. His promotion board was scheduled for next month, and any discrimination complaints under his command would be career-ending black marks. Thompson's printer hummed to life, producing the official documents that would force Chen to confront what he had been willfully ignoring. She gathered the papers with steady hands, knocked on his office door, and entered at his reluctant invitation. "Sir,
I need to file a formal complaint regarding discriminatory conduct and assault during today's training exercise, she said, placing the documents on his desk with military formality. Chen's face went pale as he scanned the report. The explicit language she had documented, the witness statements she had already begun collecting, the clear pattern of behavior, it was all there in black and white, impossible to dismiss or minimize. "Staff Sergeant," he said carefully, "are you certain this couldn't be handled through counseling and corrective training? Filing a formal complaint will trigger an investigation that could reflect poorly on this entire command." Thompson met his gaze steadily. "Sir, Sergeant Morrison physically assaulted a recruit after using explicit racial slurs. Multiple witnesses observed the incident. This goes beyond corrective training." Chen was silent for long moments, calculating the political implications. A formal investigation would draw attention from higher headquarters, potentially implicating him for failing to address previous incidents. But refusing to process a legitimate complaint with multiple witnesses would be even more damaging if it came to light later. "Process the complaint," he said finally, his voice tight with resignation. "But I want this handled discreetly. No need to create unnecessary drama that might undermine unit cohesion." As Thompson left his office with the processed paperwork, word was already spreading through Charlie Company like wildfire. Military communities were small, closed systems where information traveled faster than official communications. By evening formation, every recruit knew that something significant had happened during the field exercise, and speculation filled the barracks. Maria Rodriguez sat on her bunk updating her hidden notebook with detailed observations from the day's events. Her documentation had evolved from personal protection to potential evidence, and she understood the weight of responsibility that came with being a witness to institutional injustice.
"You really think they'll do anything?" asked Private Johnson, his voice barely above a whisper. Tank's rural upbringing had taught him to be skeptical of authority figures who promised justice after allowing injustice to fester. "They have to," Maria replied, though her voice carried more hope than certainty. "Too many people saw what happened. They can't just ignore it this time." Timothy Walsh sat across from them, wrestling with guilt and recognition. For weeks, he had benefited from Morrison's preferential treatment while watching Aaliyah suffer under discriminatory harassment. His failure to speak up earlier weighed heavily on his conscience, and his intervention during the field exercise felt inadequate compared to his previous silence. "I should have said something weeks ago," he admitted, his Midwestern sensibilities struggling with the complexity of military hierarchy and social dynamics. "I knew what was happening wasn't right, but I was scared of making things worse." Aaliyah, who had been listening quietly while cleaning her gear, finally spoke. "Fear makes cowards of us all, but courage isn't about not being afraid. It's about doing what's right despite the fear." The words carried echoes of her father's teachings, though she couldn't know that Colonel Williams was, at that very moment, reviewing routine reports that would soon shatter his world. 3 miles away in base headquarters, Colonel Williams worked late into the evening, fulfilling his commitment to thorough oversight of all training activities. His desk was covered with evaluation reports, incident summaries, and personnel files that painted a comprehensive picture of Fort Braxton's training programs. The discrimination complaint crossed his desk as part of routine notification procedures for senior leadership. Initially, it appeared to be another unfortunate but manageable incident requiring corrective action and additional training. His eyes scanned the document with professional detachment until they reached the victim's name: Private Aaliyah Williams. The words seemed to leap off the page, transforming from routine administrative text into a personal catastrophe that stopped his heart. He read the name again, hoping he had made an error, but the letters remained unchanged. His daughter, his brilliant, determined daughter, who had insisted on proving herself independently, was the victim of the discriminatory conduct detailed in the report. Marcus Williams had faced enemy fire in 3 combat deployments, had made life-or-death decisions affecting hundreds of soldiers, had navigated the complex politics of military leadership for 2 decades. But nothing had prepared him for the searing combination of parental anguish and professional fury that now coursed through his veins. He forced himself to read the complete report with clinical detachment, his military training overriding emotional response. The documented pattern of harassment, the escalating abuse, the explicit racial language, the physical assault, each detail was a knife wound to his heart and a violation of everything the uniform represented. Moving to his secure filing cabinet, he retrieved Morrison's personnel file and began a systematic review that should have been conducted years earlier. What he found was damning. 6 separate incidents of questionable conduct involving minority recruits over the past 3 years, all dismissed with minimal investigation or consequence. Comments from previous supervisors that praised Morrison's old-school discipline while glossing over complaints about his methods. At 2300 hours, he finally picked up his secure phone and dialed his home number. Patricia Williams answered on the second ring, recognizing the weight in her husband's voice immediately. "Marcus? What's wrong?" "Patricia, I need you to sit down. It's about Aaliyah." The conversation that followed was conducted in the careful language of military families accustomed to discussing sensitive matters over potentially monitored communications. Patricia's questions were precise and professional, but Marcus could hear the maternal fury building beneath her diplomatic composure. "How long has this been going on?" she asked, her voice tight with controlled emotion. "Based on the documentation, at least 3 weeks, possibly longer." There was silence as Patricia processed the implications. Their daughter had been fighting this battle alone, enduring systematic harassment and abuse while maintaining the independence she had insisted upon. "What are you going to do?" Patricia asked, though she already knew her husband well enough to recognize the dangerous calm in his voice. "I'm going to build a case that will ensure this never happens to another soldier. And I'm going to make certain that everyone who enabled this faces appropriate consequences." "Including yourself for not knowing sooner?" The question cut deep, because it echoed Marcus's own self-recrimination. As base commander, the ultimate responsibility for everything that happened at Fort Braxton rested on him. His daughter's suffering represented not just a personal failure, but a leadership failure that had allowed systemic problems to fester under his command.
"Especially myself," he admitted. As he ended the call, Colonel Williams began planning his next moves with the strategic thinking that had carried him through decades of military service. But this time, the mission was deeply personal, and the stakes couldn't be higher. Colonel Marcus Williams stood at his office window as the first gray light of dawn crept across Fort Braxton, but his mind was consumed with images from decades past. The discrimination complaint lay open on his desk behind him, each word a reminder of his own failures as both a father and a commander. Sleep had been impossible after discovering his daughter's name in the official documentation of systematic abuse. The memories came flooding back unbidden. His own experiences as a young lieutenant facing subtle but persistent racism from senior officers who questioned his qualifications, his competence, his right to wear the uniform. He remembered the careful balance required to prove himself without appearing uppity, the exhausting mental gymnastics of anticipating and diffusing racial tensions before they exploded into career-ending confrontations. Most painfully, He remembered the promise he had made to himself during those dark early years, that he would rise through the ranks and create a military where talent and character mattered more than skin color. Now, learning that his own daughter had endured the same systematic harassment under his command felt like the ultimate betrayal of that promise. At 0500 hours, he walked through the pre-dawn quiet to his secure communications room and placed a call to the Pentagon. Master Sergeant Patricia Williams answered her office phone with the crisp professionalism that had made her one of the Army's most respected family services coordinators. Patricia, I need to see Morrison's complete service record, including any documentation that might not be in his standard personnel file. And I want a comprehensive review of all discrimination complaints filed at Fort Braxton over the past 5 years. Patricia's voice carried the steel that had attracted him 20 years earlier. Already started. I've been making calls since 0300. Marcus, this goes deeper than just Morrison. She was right, and they both knew it. Over the next hour, Patricia briefed him on the systematic failures she had uncovered through her network of contacts throughout the military personnel system. Morrison's record showed a clear pattern of targeting minority recruits that had been consistently overlooked or minimized by successive commands. More disturbing, similar patterns existed throughout the training infrastructure, suggesting institutional tolerance for discriminatory behavior. Captain Chen received complaints about Morrison's methods 8 months ago, Patricia reported, her voice tight with controlled anger. He filed them under corrective counseling and took no formal action. Staff Sergeant Thompson submitted 3 separate incident reports that were never investigated. There's a paper trail of institutional indifference that goes back years. Marcus absorbed the information with growing fury. Each revelation represented not just systemic failure, but personal betrayal of the values he had spent his career defending. His daughter had been failed by an institution he had devoted his life to improving. There's more, Patricia continued. I contacted some of my sources in other commands. This isn't isolated to Fort Braxton. We're looking at patterns that exist across multiple installations, all protected by the same combination of institutional inertia and career protection instincts. The scope of the problem was staggering, but Marcus Williams had not risen to command rank by avoiding difficult battles. If anything, the magnitude of the challenge strengthened his resolve. I want a complete case file by tomorrow morning. Every incident, every witness statement, every piece of documentation. And Patricia, I want this done quietly until we're ready to present a comprehensive case that can't be minimized or dismissed. After ending the call, Marcus moved to his private bathroom and stared at his reflection in the mirror. The man looking back showed the wear of 2 decades of military service, gray threading through his hair, lines etched around eyes that had seen too much combat, shoulders that had carried the weight of command through multiple deployments. But there was something else in his reflection now, a father's determination to protect his child and an officer's commitment to institutional reform. He thought about Aaliyah's decision to enlist under her mother's maiden name, her insistence on proving herself independently without trading on his reputation. The courage and integrity that had made him proud as a father had also left her vulnerable to the very discrimination he had spent his career fighting. At 0630 a.m., his secure phone rang. The caller ID showed General Robert Hayes, his immediate superior and one of the most respected leaders in the Army. Marcus had served under Hayes during 2 deployments, and their relationship had evolved from professional respect to personal friendship built on shared values and mutual trust. Marcus, I just received some disturbing information about activities at Fort Braxton. Are you aware of discrimination complaints involving your training cadre? The general's voice carried the authority, but also concern for a subordinate he had mentored throughout his career. Marcus understood that Hayes was giving him the opportunity to brief him before the situation escalated beyond local control. Yes, sir.
I'm conducting a comprehensive investigation that should be completed within 24 hours. The situation is more serious than initial reports indicated. How serious, Marcus? The question hung in the air like a challenge. Marcus Williams had always prided himself on complete honesty with his superiors, even when the truth was professionally uncomfortable.
Sir, we're looking at systematic discrimination that was enabled by institutional indifference at multiple levels of command. The specific incident involves my daughter, but the patterns suggest problems that extend far beyond any individual case. There was a long pause as General Hayes processed the personal implications. He had known Aaliyah since she was a child, had watched her grow up on military installations, had encouraged her decision to serve her country. Learning that she had been victimized by the very institution she had chosen to serve struck him as both personally offensive and professionally unacceptable. Marcus, you have my complete support in whatever action you deem necessary, but I want this handled correctly, by the book, with full documentation, and in a way that creates lasting institutional change rather than just individual punishment. Understood, sir. That's exactly my intention. As he ended the call with General Hayes, Marcus felt a grim satisfaction in knowing he had top-level support for what was about to unfold. But he also understood the delicate balance required to achieve justice for his daughter while maintaining the integrity of the investigation process. The next few hours would be crucial. Morrison's history suggested he would continue escalating his behavior, potentially providing the undeniable evidence needed to break through institutional resistance to meaningful reform. Marcus Williams was prepared to document every detail, build an airtight case, and use his daughter's ordeal as the catalyst for changes that would protect future generations of soldiers. But first, he had to survive watching his child endure whatever Morrison had planned for her next. The mercury climbed past 95 degrees by 0800 hours, with humidity thick enough to cut with a knife. Staff Sergeant Thompson had been reassigned to administrative duties pending the investigation, leaving Morrison temporarily unsupervised and increasingly desperate. He understood that his career was hanging by a thread, but rather than accepting responsibility for his actions, he had convinced himself that Aaliyah was responsible for his predicament. Charlie Company assembled for what Morrison announced would be special intensive training designed to separate the warriors from the wannabes. The other drill instructors had been conveniently reassigned to different duties, leaving Morrison alone with the recruits in an isolated training area away from casual observation. Aaliyah stood in formation with her fellow recruits, noting the dangerous gleam in Morrison's eyes and the way he kept focusing on her with barely contained malice. Maria Rodriguez positioned herself where she could document whatever was about to unfold, while Tank Johnson and Timothy Walsh flanked Aaliyah in unconscious protective positions. "Today, we're going to test your commitment to military excellence," Morrison announced, his voice carrying the false cheerfulness of someone on the edge of complete breakdown. "Some of you have been coasting on excuses and special treatment. Today, that ends." He began with seemingly routine exercises, but quickly escalated to dangerous extremes. Push-ups in the blazing sun without water breaks, extended combat drills with full gear in temperatures that violated safety regulations, marathon runs with weighted packs that pushed recruits beyond their physical limits. But his primary focus remained on Aaliyah, subjecting her to increasingly extreme punishments disguised as training. When she completed every task flawlessly despite the brutal conditions, his frustration mounted to barely controlled rage. "Williams," as he finished a perfect series of combat rolls in full gear, "your technique is pathetic. You're moving like a tired old woman. Drop and give me 100 push-ups." The command was clearly punitive rather than corrective. Aaliyah had just completed identical exercises that had drawn no criticism when performed by other recruits, but she dropped to push-up position without complaint,
maintaining the dignity her father had taught her, even in the face of obvious injustice. By the 50th push-up, sweat was pouring from her body in steady streams. By the 70th, her arms were beginning to shake with exhaustion. By the 90th, other recruits were exchanging alarmed glances as they watched a fellow soldier being pushed beyond safe physical limits. Timothy Walsh could no longer remain silent. "Sergeant Morrison, Williams has been doing exercises for 2 hours straight in this heat. Maybe she needs a water break." Morrison whirled on Timothy with the fury of a cornered animal. "Walsh, you gutless piece of trash, nobody asked for your opinion. And Aaliyah, if you need some white boy to defend you, maybe you don't belong in my army." The racial language was explicit and undeniable, heard by every recruit in the formation. But Morrison was beyond caring about witnesses or consequences. The investigation had already destroyed his career, and he was determined to take Aaliyah down with him. "You people," he continued, his voice rising to near hysteria, "think you can just walk into our military and demand special treatment? Well, I've got news for you. This is still my training company, and I decide who gets to wear the uniform." Tank Johnson's massive hands clenched into fists as he watched Morrison's complete breakdown. Every instinct screamed at him to intervene physically, but military discipline and training held him in check. Maria Rodriguez was frantically writing in her notebook, documenting every word for future testimony.
Morrison grabbed a 20-pound weighted vest and threw it at Aaliyah's feet. "Put it on! You want to be a soldier? Prove you can handle a soldier's load." The additional weight, combined with the extreme heat and her existing exhaustion, pushed Aaliyah into dangerous territory. But she strapped on the vest without complaint, maintaining military bearing even as her vision began to blur around the edges. "Now give me 50 burpees," Morrison screamed, spittle flying from his lips, "and if I hear one complaint, we start over from the beginning." Aaliyah began the exercise, her movements becoming increasingly unsteady as heat exhaustion took hold. Other recruits watched in horror as their fellow soldier was systematically tortured under the guise of military training. When she stumbled slightly during the 20th burpee, Morrison exploded with final, catastrophic rage. "You pathetic excuse for a soldier! You think because Daddy might have been in the service, that gives you some special status? Well, let me tell you something about your people." The racist tirade that followed was so vile, so explicitly hateful, that even hardened military recruits were shocked into silence. Morrison's complete breakdown revealed the depth of his racism and the extent of his abuse of authority. But his next action crossed every line of military law and human decency. As Aaliyah struggled to complete another burpee, Morrison kicked her in the ribs hard enough to send her sprawling in the dirt. "Get up!" he screamed, drawing his foot back for another kick. "I'm not done with you yet." The physical assault in front of multiple witnesses represented a complete abandonment of military professionalism and legal boundaries. Tank Johnson took a half step forward, his protective instincts finally overriding military discipline, but Timothy Walsh was already moving. "Stop!" Timothy shouted, positioning himself between Morrison and Aaliyah. "This isn't training, this is abuse!" Morrison's response was to shove Timothy hard enough to send him stumbling backward. "Get out of my way, you pathetic white knight! This bitch needs to learn her place!" The scene had devolved into complete chaos. Morrison in full breakdown, Aaliyah struggling to stand despite her injuries, Timothy trying to protect her, Tank advancing with clear intent to intervene physically, and Maria documenting everything while other recruits stood frozen in shock. Unknown to any of them, Colonel Williams had been monitoring the situation through electronic surveillance, gathering evidence for the comprehensive case he was building. What he was witnessing through the remote cameras went beyond his worst fears, forcing him to abandon his careful planning and take immediate action.
The sound of approaching vehicles cut through Morrison's ranting. Multiple Humvees were racing toward their position, carrying senior officers and military police who would finally put an end to the systematic abuse that had been allowed to fester for too long. Morrison, seeing his career and freedom disappearing before his eyes, made one final lunge toward Aaliyah with clear intent to cause serious harm. But this time, Tank Johnson's protective instincts overrode military discipline entirely. The giant from rural Mississippi stepped forward and caught Morrison's arm with a grip that could have crushed bone, his gentle nature finally giving way to righteous anger. "No," Tank said simply, his voice carrying the weight of moral authority. "This ends now." The vehicles skidded to a halt in clouds of dust, discouraging officers and medical personnel who would finally provide the intervention that should have occurred weeks earlier. The institutional machinery that had enabled Morrison's abuse was about to face a reckoning that would transform not just Fort Braxton, but military culture itself. Colonel Williams emerged from the lead Humvee in full battle dress uniform, his face a mask of controlled fury as he surveyed the scene of his daughter's systematic torture. The moment of revelation was at hand, and justice would finally have its day. The dust cloud from the convoy of military vehicles settled like a curtain lifting on the final act of a long overdue drama. Colonel Marcus Williams emerged from the lead Humvee with the controlled precision of a man who had spent 2 decades mastering the art of command presence. His battle dress uniform was immaculate despite the urgency of his arrival, every insignia and ribbon a testament to years of distinguished service. But behind his military bearing, a father's fury burned with white-hot intensity. Morrison, still gripping Aaliyah's arm in his final attempt at violence, froze as he recognized the approaching figure. The base commander's presence at what should have been routine recruit training was unprecedented and ominous. Around him, the recruits snapped to attention with the automatic response drilled into them through weeks of intensive training. "Release that soldier immediately." Colonel Williams' voice carried the unmistakable authority of supreme command, cutting through the oppressive heat like a blade. Morrison's hand fell away from Aaliyah as if he had been struck by lightning. Behind the colonel came a phalanx of senior officers and military police, their presence transforming the isolated training area into an official crime scene. Major Patricia Hayes from the Judge Advocate General's office carried a thick folder of legal documents, while Captain Rodriguez from the Criminal Investigation Division activated recording equipment that would capture every word of the proceedings.
Aaliyah struggled to her feet, swaying slightly from heat exhaustion and the physical abuse she had endured. Through her blurred vision, she recognized the approaching figure with a mixture of relief and complex emotions. Her father's arrival meant safety from Morrison's persecution, but it also meant the end of her carefully maintained independence. "Sir," Morrison stammered, his earlier rage replaced by desperate self-preservation instincts. "Colonel Williams, I was conducting authorized training exercises within established parameters." "Sergeant Morrison," the colonel interrupted, his voice carrying the deadly calm that subordinates had learned to fear more than shouting. "You are hereby relieved of all training responsibilities and placed under arrest pending court-martial proceedings." The formal language carried the weight of military law, but Marcus Williams was fighting every parental instinct to abandon protocol and tend to his daughter's injuries. The sight of her bloodied lip, the bruises on her arms, the obvious signs of systematic abuse, it took every ounce of his professional discipline to maintain command composure. Military Police Sergeant First Class Johnson stepped forward with handcuffs, but Morrison made one final, desperate attempt to salvage his situation. "Colonel, sir, with all due respect, this recruit has been a disciplinary problem from day one. I was using appropriate corrective measures to maintain unit standards." "Appropriate corrective measures." Colonel Williams stepped closer, his voice dropping to a whisper that somehow carried more menace than screaming. "Sergeant Morrison,
I have been monitoring this situation for several days. I have documentation of systematic harassment, discriminatory treatment, and now witnessed assault in violation of the Uniform Code of Military Justice. The recruit stood in stunned silence, processing the implications of the colonel's words. He had been monitoring the situation, which meant he had known what was happening and had allowed it to continue while gathering evidence. The strategic thinking was impressive, but the personal cost to Aaliyah was evident in every bruise and cut on her body. As the military police restrained Morrison, Colonel Williams turned his attention to the assembled recruits. His daughter stood among them, maintaining military posture despite her obvious pain, and he felt his heart break and swell with pride simultaneously. "Recruits of Charlie Company," he began, his voice carrying across the formation with parade ground authority. "What you have witnessed today is not military training. It is not discipline. It is not leadership. It is the abuse of authority by someone who forgot that we serve the Constitution and the values it represents." He paused, allowing the words to sink in while making eye contact with each recruit. "Private Williams, front and center." Aaliyah stepped forward on unsteady legs, coming to attention before the base commander. For a moment, father and daughter faced each other in their official capacities, the weight of their concealed relationship adding complexity to an already charged situation. "Private Williams," Colonel Williams continued, his voice steady despite the emotional turmoil beneath the surface. "I want you to know that your conduct throughout this ordeal has exemplified the highest traditions of military service. You have shown courage, dignity, and leadership under the most difficult circumstances." He reached into his pocket and withdrew a small leather case containing his personal coin, the traditional military token given to recognize exceptional performance. As he pressed it into her palm, his fingers lingered for just a moment, the only outward sign of their relationship. "Sir," Aaliyah replied, her voice hoarse but steady, "I was just doing my duty." The simple response carried echoes of generations of Williams' family military service, and Marcus felt a surge of pride that transcended his role as commanding officer. But there was more that needed to be said, more that needed to be revealed. "There's something else, Private Williams, something that Sergeant Morrison never knew when he targeted you for harassment and abuse." The formation seemed to hold its collective breath as Colonel Williams prepared to reveal the truth that would recontextualize everything that had transpired over the past weeks. "Private Williams, please state your full legal name for the record." Aaliyah's eyes widened slightly as she understood what was about to happen. "Sir, my full legal name is Aaliyah Marie Williams, daughter of Colonel Marcus Williams and Master Sergeant Patricia Williams." The revelation hit the formation like a physical blow. Gasps and muttered exclamations rippled through the ranks as the recruits processed the magnitude of Morrison's error. He had been systematically abusing the base commander's daughter, unaware that every action was being documented by the one person with ultimate authority to ensure justice. Morrison, now in handcuffs, went pale as the full scope of his catastrophic misjudgment became clear. Not only had he violated military law and basic human decency, but he had done so against someone whose father commanded the entire installation. Timothy Walsh felt his knees go weak as he realized the implications. Maria Rodriguez closed her notebook with trembling hands, understanding that her documentation had been even more crucial than she had imagined. Tank Johnson smiled grimly, satisfied that justice would finally be served.
Recruits Colonel Williams continued, his voice carrying both authority and compassion. Private Williams chose to enlist under her mother's maiden name and requested that her family connection remain confidential. She wanted to earn her place in this army through merit, not through influence or favoritism. He turned to face Morrison directly, his eyes carrying the full weight of paternal fury barely contained by military discipline.
Sergeant Morrison's actions were not just violations of military law and human decency. They were attacks on a young soldier who was trying to prove herself through excellence and dedication. As military medical personnel attended to Aaliyah's injuries, Colonel Williams addressed the broader implications of what had transpired. This incident will trigger a comprehensive review of training procedures, complaint processes, and leadership accountability throughout this command. We will ensure that no soldier ever again faces the systematic discrimination that Private Williams endured. The formation was dismissed, leaving father and daughter alone for the first time since the revelation. For a moment, military protocol gave way to human emotion, as Marcus Williams embraced his injured child, feeling both pride in her strength and guilt for the suffering she had endured under his command. "I'm sorry, Aaliyah," he whispered, his voice breaking slightly. "I should have stopped this sooner." "No, Dad," she replied, using the familiar address for the first time in weeks. "I needed to prove I could handle it on my own. And now we have the evidence to make sure it never happens to anyone else." The revelation had changed everything, but it was only the beginning of a transformation that would ultimately reshape the culture of Fort Braxton and ripple throughout the military establishment. 3 weeks later, Fort Braxton's main conference room had been converted into a formal hearing chamber where the institutional failures that had enabled Morrison's abuse would face comprehensive examination. General Robert Hayes presided over the proceedings with the gravitas of someone who understood that the military's credibility was at stake. The mahogany table was surrounded by senior officers, legal representatives, and civilian oversight officials whose presence signaled that this investigation would extend far beyond individual accountability. General Hayes, a Vietnam veteran who had witnessed the military's integration struggles firsthand, brought both historical perspective and moral authority to the proceedings. His weathered face carried the lines of someone who had seen combat, commanded troops in peace and war, and understood the critical importance of institutional integrity. "This investigation," he began, his voice carrying the weight of 4 decades of military service, "will examine not just the actions of Sergeant Morrison, but the systemic failures that allowed discriminatory behavior to persist undetected and unaddressed for years." Captain Chen sat at the witness table, his dress blue uniform immaculate, but his composure visibly strained. The ambitious officer who had once seen promotion boards in his future now faced potential career termination for his role in enabling Morrison's conduct. Captain Chen, Major Hayes from the Judge Advocate General's office, began her questioning. "You received formal complaints about Sergeant Morrison's training methods on 3 separate occasions over the past 8 months. Can you explain why no formal investigations were initiated?" Chen's carefully prepared responses crumbled under detailed questioning that revealed his pattern of minimizing complaints to avoid controversy that might reflect poorly on his command. His priority had been maintaining the appearance of smooth operations rather than addressing underlying problems that could complicate his promotion timeline. "Sir, I believe that counseling and corrective training would address any minor issues without the need for formal disciplinary action." "Minor issues?" Major Hayes consulted her notes with theatrical precision. "According to documentation provided by Staff Sergeant Thompson, these complaints included allegations of racially motivated harassment, excessive punishment targeting minority recruits, and inappropriate language in violation of equal opportunity policies. Which of these do you consider minor, Captain? The question hung in the air like an indictment, exposing the willful blindness that had characterized Chen's leadership. Around the room, other officers shifted uncomfortably as they recognized similar compromises they had made in their own careers.
Why did it take so long for you to file the formal complaint that ultimately triggered this investigation? Thompson's answers struck at the heart of military culture's most persistent problems. Sir, in my experience, officers who raise uncomfortable questions about discrimination or harassment were often labeled as troublemakers who couldn't maintain unit cohesion. I was advised early in my career that questioning superior officers' methods could be career-limiting. The testimony continued with Maria Rodriguez providing detailed documentation of Morrison's behavior patterns, Tank Johnson describing the climate of fear that kept witnesses silent, and Timothy Walsh offering the perspective of someone who had initially benefited from preferential treatment before recognizing its moral implications. But the most powerful testimony came from Aaliyah herself, who had requested permission to address the hearing despite her father's concerns about subjecting her to additional scrutiny. "General Hayes," she began, her voice steady despite the weight of addressing such senior leadership, "I want this hearing to understand that my experience was not unique. During my time in basic training, I observed similar patterns of discrimination affecting other minority recruits who didn't have my family connections or resources." She presented a comprehensive analysis of training statistics that revealed systematic disparities in how minority and white recruits were evaluated, disciplined, and advanced through the program. Her presentation demonstrated not just the personal injustice that she had endured, but the institutional scope of the problem. The investigation must address not just Sergeant Morrison's individual actions, but the culture that protected and enabled those actions. Real reform requires changing the systems that allow bias to operate under the cover of military discipline. General Hayes studied the young soldier with evident admiration. "Private Williams, your analysis demonstrates exceptional insight into institutional dynamics. Have you considered pursuing advanced education in military leadership or policy?" The suggestion carried implications beyond the current proceeding, hinting at opportunities that might emerge from her ordeal. But Aaliyah's response reflected the independence that had driven her decision to enlist anonymously. "Sir, I want to earn any future opportunities through demonstrated performance, not as compensation for what I've endured. But I do hope my experience can contribute to systemic changes that protect other soldiers." The hearing's final phase focused on comprehensive reforms designed to prevent future incidents. Colonel Williams presented a detailed plan developed with input from military justice experts, civil rights organizations, and academic researchers specializing in institutional bias. The proposed reforms included mandatory bias training for all leadership personnel, independent oversight of complaint processes, regular climate surveys to identify problem areas before they escalated, and career protections for personnel who reported discrimination or harassment. General Hayes concluded the hearing with remarks that would be quoted in military leadership courses for years to come. "The strength of our military depends not just on our weapons or tactics, but on our commitment to the values we defend. When we allow discrimination to persist in our ranks, we betray both our Constitution and our soldiers." The comprehensive investigation had exposed institutional failures that extended far beyond Fort Braxton, creating momentum for reforms that would reshape military culture across multiple installations. But the most immediate impact would be felt by the individuals whose courage had forced the military establishment to confront its own shortcomings. 6 months after the hearing that had exposed systematic discrimination at Fort Braxton, the base had become a model for institutional reform that attracted visitors from military installations worldwide.
The changes implemented went beyond policy modifications to encompass fundamental shifts in culture, training, and accountability that transformed the experience of every soldier who served there. Aaliyah Williams, now promoted to private first class, stood before a new class of recruits in her role as peer mentor and leadership instructor. The young woman who had endured weeks of systematic abuse had emerged as a powerful voice for military excellence built on dignity and respect rather than intimidation and bias. Excellence, she told the diverse group of new soldiers facing their first day of basic training, is not about breaking people down through humiliation or harassment. True military excellence is built on mutual respect, shared commitment to mission accomplishment, and the understanding that our strength comes from our diversity of backgrounds and perspectives. The recruits, black, white, Hispanic, Asian, male, female, representing every region of America, listened with rapt attention to someone whose story had become legendary throughout the military establishment. Her presence communicated that the military had fundamentally changed its approach to developing leaders. Behind her stood Staff Sergeant Jennifer Thompson, whose moral courage in reporting Morrison's misconduct had earned her rapid promotion and assignment as senior instructor for the base's new leadership and ethics program. Thompson's career, rather than being damaged by her decision to challenge systemic problems, had flourished under leadership that valued institutional integrity over comfortable silence. Private Williams represents the best of military values. She faced systematic discrimination with dignity, maintained her commitment to excellence despite unfair treatment, and used her experience to create positive change that benefits every soldier who serves after her. The transformation extended throughout the command structure. Captain Chen had been
Reassigned to a dust job at a remote installation, his career effectively ended by his failure to address known problems. His replacement, Major Sarah Kim, brought extensive experience in diversity and inclusion programs, along with a reputation for zero tolerance for discriminatory behavior. General Hayes had used the Fort Braxton investigation as a catalyst for Army-wide reforms that were being implemented across dozens of installations. The comprehensive approach addressed everything from initial recruiting practices to senior leadership development, creating systemic changes that would shape military culture for generations. Timothy Walsh, now a squad leader despite his relatively junior status, worked closely with new recruits to help them navigate the complex dynamics of military service while maintaining personal integrity. His transformation from passive beneficiary of privilege to active advocate for equality demonstrated the possibility of individual growth within institutional change. I learned that staying silent in the face of injustice makes you complicit in that injustice, he told his squad during their weekly leadership discussion. Being a good soldier means standing up for your battle buddies, especially when they're being treated unfairly. Tank Johnson had discovered unexpected leadership abilities through his experience defending Aaliyah during Morrison's final assault. The gentle giant from rural Mississippi had been selected for advanced training programs that would prepare him for senior non-commissioned officer positions where his moral courage could influence future generations of soldiers. Maria Rodriguez had parlayed her meticulous documentation of discriminatory incidents into assignment as an assistant to the base's equal opportunity officer, where her bilingual skills and cultural insights helped create programs that addressed the needs of soldiers from diverse backgrounds. The most visible symbol of institutional change was the newly constructed Leadership Development Center, where all military personnel received training in bias recognition, cultural competency, and ethical decision-making. The building's dedication plaque bore a simple inscription: excellence through respect and dignity. Morrison himself had been court-martialed, convicted on multiple charges including assault, discrimination, and violation of military regulations. His 5-year prison sentence and dishonorable discharge sent a clear message throughout the military establishment that discriminatory behavior would face serious consequences regardless of rank or years of service. But perhaps the most significant transformation was evident in the relationship between Colonel Williams and his daughter, who had found ways to balance their professional and personal connections while maintaining the independence that had driven her decision to enlist anonymously. "Dad,
Aaliyah said during one of their regular evening walks around the base. "I know this has been hard for you, watching what happened and not being able to intervene immediately." Marcus Williams, whose handling of the discrimination case had earned him promotion to brigadier general, considered his response carefully. "Aaliyah, the hardest part wasn't watching you suffer, it was recognizing that the institution I'd devoted my career to improving had failed you so completely." "But it didn't fail me, Dad. The system worked exactly as it was supposed to work. You built the case methodically, gathered irrefutable evidence, and created changes that will protect thousands of future soldiers. Sometimes the long view requires short-term sacrifice." Her mature perspective on the strategic implications of their approach reflected leadership qualities that had been forged through adversity and refined through experience. The young woman who had insisted on proving herself independently had emerged as a leader whose credibility was unquestionable. As they walked past the training areas where new recruits were learning military skills in an environment transformed by their shared ordeal, both father and daughter understood that they had participated in something larger than individual justice. They had helped catalyze institutional evolution that would shape American military culture for decades to come. The base's transformation from a place where discrimination was tolerated to a model of inclusive excellence represented more than policy changes or procedural reforms. It demonstrated that institutions could change when individuals with moral courage were willing to challenge systemic problems, even at personal cost. The story of Fort Braxton would be studied in military leadership courses, civil rights programs, and organizational psychology classes as an example of how individual courage could create institutional transformation. But for the soldiers who lived through the change, it represented something simpler and more profound. Proof that the military's highest values of honor, integrity, and service could triumph over the prejudice and indifference that had too long been accepted as inevitable. The final test of transformation would come not in the immediate aftermath of reform, but in the daily choices made by thousands of leaders at every level who had learned that excellence required not just technical competence, but moral courage and institutional integrity. The legacy of Aaliyah Williams and the Fort Braxton investigation would be measured in the careers of soldiers who would never face the discrimination she had endured because the system had finally learned to live up to its own highest ideals. 2 years after the transformation of Fort Braxton, Sergeant Aaliyah Williams stood at the podium of the Army War College addressing a gathering of senior military leaders from across the globe. The young woman who had once scrubbed floors as punishment for helping a struggling battle buddy now wore the chevrons of a non-commissioned officer and bore the
confidence of someone whose experience had reshaped institutional thinking about leadership, dignity, and military excellence. Leadership, she told the audience of colonels, generals, and international military attachés, is not about breaking people down to build them up. True leadership recognizes that our greatest strength lies not in creating uniform conformity, but in forging unity from our diversity of backgrounds, perspectives, and experiences. In the audience, Brigadier General Marcus Williams watched his daughter with a mixture of paternal pride and professional admiration. The investigation that had begun with her systematic abuse had evolved into a comprehensive reform movement that was reshaping military culture across multiple nations. Foreign military leaders were studying the Fort Braxton model as a blueprint for addressing institutional bias within their own forces. The ripple effects of their shared ordeal had extended far beyond individual justice or even institutional reform. Congressional hearings had led to legislative changes in military law. Academic institutions were incorporating their case study into leadership and organizational psychology curricula. Civil rights organizations were using their story to advocate for systemic changes in civilian institutions that paralleled military hierarchies. Major Sarah Kim, who had replaced the disgraced Captain Chen, now oversaw the most successful diversity and inclusion program in the Army. Her methods, refined through trial and error at Fort Braxton, were being implemented at installations worldwide. The key insight she had developed was that effective change required not just policy modifications, but fundamental shifts in how leaders understood their responsibilities to subordinates. The old model assumed that harsh treatment would somehow forge stronger soldiers, Major Kim explained during her presentation to the War College audience. What we learned through comprehensive data analysis is that soldiers who are treated with dignity and respect consistently outperform those subjected to intimidation and harassment across every measurable metric. The statistical evidence was overwhelming and had fundamentally altered military training doctrine. Graduation rates had improved. Disciplinary incidents had decreased. Most significantly, retention rates among high-performing minority soldiers had increased dramatically, enriching the military with diverse talent that had previously been driven away by hostile environments. Staff Sergeant Jennifer Thompson, whose moral courage in reporting Morrison's conduct had earned her assignment as the Army's senior advisor on institutional bias, presented research that had transformed understanding of how discrimination operated within military structures. Her work demonstrated that bias was rarely the product of individual hatred, but more commonly the result of systemic indifference that allowed problematic behaviors to persist unchallenged. The Morrison case was significant not because it represented unusual behavior, but because it revealed how ordinary institutional failures could enable extraordinary harm. Our reforms focus on creating systems that identify and address problems before they reach crisis levels. Timothy Walsh, now a staff sergeant himself, had become a sought-after instructor in the military's expanded ethics and leadership programs. His perspective as someone who had initially benefited from preferential treatment before recognizing its moral implications provided unique insights into how privilege operated within military hierarchies. "I learned that good intentions aren't enough," he told classes of future leaders. "You can't just avoid being actively discriminatory. You have to actively work to ensure fairness and opportunity for everyone under your command. Passive compliance with regulations isn't leadership. Active promotion of dignity and respect is." Tank Johnson, whose gentle nature had masked remarkable leadership potential, now served as a master sergeant responsible for developing mentorship programs that paired experienced soldiers with newcomers from diverse backgrounds. His approach emphasized the military's core values of mutual support and collective success, rather than competition and individual advancement at others' expense. "The Army taught me that taking care of your people isn't just about their physical welfare. It's about creating an environment where everyone can contribute their best efforts without fear of unfair treatment or discrimination." Maria Rodriguez had leveraged her documentation skills and cultural insights into a career in military intelligence, where her ability to recognize patterns and detail-oriented analysis had proven invaluable. But she also continued serving as a consultant for the Equal Opportunity Program, helping develop training materials that addressed the subtle ways bias could manifest in military settings. The most profound transformation was evident in the daily operations of military installations that had implemented the Fort Braxton model. The aggressive, intimidation-based culture that had characterized military training for generations had given way to approaches that emphasized professional development, mutual respect, and excellence achieved through positive leadership rather than fear-based compliance. Visiting Fort Braxton now, observers would find training environments that were demanding but not demeaning, challenging but not discriminatory. Drill instructors still pushed recruits to exceed their perceived limitations, but they did so through encouragement and professional development rather than systematic humiliation and bias. The economic implications had proven as significant as the moral ones. The military was retaining talented personnel who would previously have been driven away by hostile environments. Training was more efficient when soldiers could focus on skill development rather than navigating discriminatory treatment. Mission effectiveness had improved across multiple measures as units became more cohesive and inclusive. Perhaps most importantly, the changes had begun attracting recruits from communities that had historically viewed military service with suspicion due to concerns about discriminatory treatment. The diversification of military ranks was creating a force that better represented American society and brought broader perspectives to national defense challenges. As Sergeant Williams concluded her presentation to the War College audience, she reflected on the personal journey that had brought her from anonymous recruit to nationally recognized leader. The systematic abuse she had endured had been transformed into a catalyst for institutional evolution that would benefit countless future soldiers. Change is never easy, especially in institutions with strong traditions and established cultures, she told the assembled leaders. But our oath requires us to defend not just our nation's territory, but its values. When we allow discrimination and bias to persist in our ranks, we betray both our Constitution and our fellow soldiers. The standing ovation that followed represented more than appreciation for her presentation. It symbolized institutional commitment to the principles she had championed through personal sacrifice and professional courage. The young woman who had once faced systematic persecution had become a voice for transformation that resonated throughout the military establishment and beyond. The legacy of Fort Braxton would be measured not in the punishment of individual wrongdoers, but in the countless careers that would flourish in environments shaped by dignity, respect, and genuine commitment to excellence. The commander's daughter had helped transform not just the military base, but the very conception of what military leadership could and should represent in a democratic society.
Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.